this is Kevin Cromash with Corporation2020. I'm here today in South Royalton, Vermont, on the campus of Vermont Law School with Professor Gus Speth. Just to begin, to give our viewers a bit of a background on Corporation2020, the reason we chose 2020 in the name as opposed to 2050 or 2100 is that we really think we don't have that much time. How do you generally express the urgency of these issues?
We're losing species now at 1,000 times the rate that species normally go extinct. Every point of delay is a buildup of this. And one way to capsulize this, I think, is to say that if we don't act soon to reverse the current trends, we will in effect leave a ruined planet later in this century to our grandchildren. And I have 5 beautiful grandchildren now, and I worry about them a lot and what type of world we are leaving them.
Throughout your career, you've used a variety of techniques to try to address these issues. You've litigated using federal environmental laws, you've testified and lobbied Congress, you've encouraged people to take to the streets. How do you see collaborating with the business community fitting into some of these strategies?
Well, I think the business community has undergone a huge transformation. But I would say a very partial transformation. Business was extremely unobservant of environmental issues when we started in 1970. It just really wasn't on their radar scopes. Now all the companies have senior vice presidents or vice presidents for environment, health, and safety, and are making efforts at various levels to comply with regulations. But in general, the U.S. business community, which is the only one that I follow with any closely, the U.S. business community is basically, in a way, quite unresponsive to environmental needs. Spends an immense amount of money lobbying to prevent tighter environmental controls. Spends a lot of money on campaign finance to get elected officials in power who won't act on these issues. And so in general, we ought to be working with those companies which are trying to move forward and are supporting the right types of legislation and regulatory initiatives. But in general, this is not a pretty picture. The U.S. corporate community is nowhere near where it should be in terms of complying with environmental needs and addressing environmental needs. So we have these encompassing problems, and when you have encompassing problems, you have to appreciate that it's not due to small reasons. There's something fundamentally wrong with this system of political economy that's giving rise to problems across such a broad front. And corporations are the principal actors in this system of political economy. We always have known that corporations were the principal economic actors, but we now appreciate, I think, that corporations and those who have made great fortunes from corporations are the principal political actors in our system as well. So this is very unsettling, and when Prabhat Sukhdev comes along and writes an extraordinary book, backs it up with an extraordinary campaign and a really good website to promote corporate change, the change in the basic culture, definition, and orientation of corporations in our society. It's very timely, and it's very important to take what he has to say seriously.
You've written about the need for a revised capitalist system, and you've focused on a need to change how corporations operate. And a big part of that is getting prices right. And at Corporation2020, we call that accounting for externalities.
There are 2 things that are pretty common in the corporate community. Corporations have been called externalizing machines because they're really deeply committed to maximizing profits by keeping certain costs off their books, indeed keeping as much of the cost of production off their books as possible. And when they're not footing the bill for the damages that they cause, whether they're social damages or community damages or environmental damages, those damages are borne by society at large. And the other big thing is what the economist James Galbraith calls the predator state. Corporations are feeding hungrily now at the federal and governmental trough, getting loopholes, tax breaks, subsidies, and other types of benefits from government. And the combination of these two things, these externalities and these subsidies, mean that the prices are radically low because the companies are offloading these costs onto society at large. So we have environmentally dishonest prices today. So what does that mean? Well, it means that you're going to have to combine environmental programs with social programs.
That brings us to how to internalize those prices. It's sort of blasphemous in the U.S. to bring up the issue of taxation, but I think it has to be addressed. We at CORP2020, one of our main planks is moving taxes from positive things like profits and income to negative things like resource extraction and pollution, taxing the bads, not the goods.
Right.
Do you see this as a viable solution? Do you think this could move us towards the economy that you envision?
I think in today's political climate, it's going to be very difficult to be brutally frank about it. This is such a climate of political distrust in the U.S., in Washington, that doing anything major of that type is going to pose difficulties. But having a certain sort of neutrality to it does help politically in this climate, and so I think it has a chance. In general, I am absolutely convinced that we ought to be imposing what the economists call Pigouvian taxes on all these externalities, and we ought to be getting rid of these subsidies. We ought to be taxing the externalities, in fact, taxing the pollution, for example, to prohibit pollution from exceeding assimilative capacities. We ought to be taxing virgin material extractions or removing virgin materials from the natural environment. Just say, take renewable resources, we ought to be taxing the extraction of renewable resources at a level that ensures that we don't exceed the regenerative capacities of those resources. So these are difficult political things, but they're important to try. Very important to try, because they would move us dramatically in the right direction if we accomplished them.
You've hit upon an important point that the success of an idea doesn't depend just on its merits. It depends on the communication of it and the political reception that it receives. So that brings us to the issue of advertising. How do you think that corporate advertising could be modified so as to prevent greenwashing, say, or...
Well, it's not just greenwashing. Advertising is one of the pillars on which our consumerism rests. And we are constantly enticed to spend money and to consume on things that we don't really need, particularly in the advanced, the well-to-do countries, the affluent societies. So we need to regulate advertising a lot more strictly. You can ride around Vermont and you won't see any billboards. Outdoor advertising is a huge part of advertising. It ought to be strictly regulated. I don't know how many people are running off the road looking at the billboards and things like that. But just as children are now, the advertising to children was deregulated under the Reagan administration. The average child now watches, the average child of somebody like, under 6, I think it is, now watches 22,000 ads each year. So we need to regulate the advertising to children, as it's done in the Nordic countries, in Quebec. We need to regulate outdoor advertising for a variety of reasons. But the thing I think we really ought to do is to eliminate the deductibility of advertising expenses as a normal and ordinary business expense. We really need to have a process that regulates advertising to ensure that the information conveyed is accurate, that the product accomplishes the things that the advertising actually claims it does, so, I mean, we need some truth in advertising legislation that's much stricter, and it needs to be backed up by effective agency action.
So, if we were to see all these changes that we've talked about, see the changes in advertising, accounting for externalities, the new taxation structures, what do you think the world would look like? What would be the Corporation 2020 in your view?
Well, I think we need, first and foremost, policies and measures that, in effect, align corporate values with social needs, that ensure that the corporation is actually serving an important public purpose. And that alignment is very out of whack today. It doesn't exist. I mean, the corporations exist to make a profit, and they make a profit in part by growing. And they have this huge growth imperative built into the current system, and you have corporations doing things like externalizing cost in order to maximize those profits. So we've got to change this environment. Another way to ensure that corporations are aligned with public purpose is to have a process of looking at major investments. A democratic process that that ensures that the big corporate decisions about the direction of investments are in effect reviewed, much as investments now are reviewed by public utility commissions, if it involves energy or water or something. So I think there are ways to try to align the major corporations with a public purpose. One that I haven't talked about yet in this interview, which is very important, and I would put it at the top of the list, is pro-democracy political reform, and building a movement to drive pro-democracy political reform. Because if we don't salvage our politics from this creeping corporatocracy and plutocracy that we see now so prominently coming to the forefront with the super PACs and all the money that's flooding into our politics, if we don't address the political issue and straighten and really achieve a high measure of real citizen sovereignty and build a political movement that can drive those changes, then the types of things that really need to be done to address environment and social and other issues are going to be difficult to impossible. So we need this new politics in America, first and foremost. This is a very serious issue. I mean, the whole issue of the future of the corporation was setting the corporation in a different context, changing the DNA of the corporation by creating a different environment in which corporations operate. This has to happen, and I think Pavan is right that it needs to start soon, and we need to make some major changes in the coming years, not decades.
Professor Speth, it's an honor.
Thank you very much.